Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are taking a closer look at the recently released Just Flight Hawk T1. Fair warning, quite a lot of the content that you'll see in today's video we also covered during our preview of the Just Flight Hawk. Nonetheless, I think the flight should still be good fun. As mentioned during the preview, the Just Flight Hawk an absolutely excellent aircraft, and we've gone for a little bit of a change of scenery today. We're going to be blasting around the Swiss Alps. This video will be a full review of the aircraft, but as we've done with a couple of reviews now, as we're a little bit behind the curve, we'll carry out our flight first so that those that want to watch can enjoy that, and we'll finish up the review with the various other items regarding the add-on. In terms of our flight, we've got a cracking little route to run the Hawk around today. I've basically come up with my own little Swiss version of the Mach loop. I'll leave a picture of the routing up on the screen so that if you want to try it yourself you can hopefully plot it out within Microsoft Flight Simulator. I highly recommend giving it a go, as you'll see for yourselves in a few moments' time. It's a really fun little route. Essentially, we're going to be departing out of Molly Air Base, and apologies for the pronunciations, they're probably going to be pretty atrocious throughout the review, but we'll be tracking out towards the west, towards the town of Altdorf. We'll cut up the lake to the north, and then heading back through the valleys out towards the east. The entire route takes somewhere within the order of around 10 minutes, and as I say, well worth giving it a try for yourselves. It's really great fun. Anyway, we'll be carrying out the flight first, we'll then carry out a few manoeuvres in the aircraft, and then as I say, the video is a full review, so after that we'll look in a little bit more detail at the various options and configurations of the aircraft, and finally we'll wrap up with my overall thoughts and opinions on the product. As always guys, I do hope you enjoy the video and find it to be of use. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you have any comments or questions for me, you can leave those down in the comments section below. I think I already made my sentiments on the Hawk pretty clear during my preview of the aircraft. It's an add-on that I've very much been enjoying in the sim to date, so probably no surprises really throughout the video. Nonetheless, very much looking forward to taking the aircraft on another spin, so let's head for the cockpit and we'll get the aircraft started up. So welcome to the cockpit of the Just Flight Hawk T1. We've just got ourselves settled in. So far we've carried out the initial checks, we're now down to the strapping in checks. The rudder pedals have been locked off, the battery switches can come on. So just checking the battery 1 voltage, that's within limits. We'll do the same on number 2. And again the voltage checks. So both batteries are on. For the external lights, the nav lights can come on. And the parking brake is set. For the internal checks, we'll come down to the left console. The low pressure fuel cock can go on. Engine start switch is off. Fuel pump switch is on. Pitot heat is off. Tailplane standby trim cover is down. Ignition switch is set to normal. Throttle. We have full and free movement. And the HP fuel cock is off. Anti-skid switch is off. Standby UHF switch is set to main. And the brake pressures are checked. We do have a little bit of hydraulic pressure there in the system as well. On the left instrument panel, the undercarriage standby handle is in. Same for the flap standby handle. The landing gear indications, we have the gear selected down and we have 3 greens. Voltmeter is checked. Flap selector, we have the flap selected up and the flaps indicating up. And the UHF radio can go to main. For the centre and lower instrument panels, the directional gyro is checked, no flag. Same on the turn and slip indicator. Accelerometer has been reset. Main attitude indicator, we do have a flag there, we're expecting to see that at the moment. And the same on the horizontal situation indicator. For the AHRS, that can go to slave. And the latitude is set. ILS marker light has been tested. UHF power switch is set to normal. Main altimeter, again we have a flag there which we're expecting to see at the moment. Standby attitude indicator is checked. And the standby instrument switch is set to normal. Onto the right instrument panel, the oxygen quantity is checked and we do have oxygen flow. Fuel quantity, we have 1000 kilos of fuel on board, which is going to be more than enough for the flight today. Rotation and GTS indicators are out. CWP will carry out a test. And the remaining lights we're expecting to see there on the CWP with the aircraft in its current state. Lighting switches are set, dimmer switches are set. Onto the right hand console, the CCS is set to normal. VHF is set to transmit. Cabin air conditioning is set to normal. Cabin air temperature switch is set to auto. IFF is not required, the transponder can go to standby. ILS and TACAN will leave off for the flight today, and we are now ready to close up. So the canopy's down, the arrows are aligned, we'll lock that up. And now ready for the start. So the engine start switches in both cockpits need to be turned on. Worth noting, you do have to turn that on down the back as well, but we've already done that during the initial checks. Anti-collision lights are on. We'll hit the GTS starter button. And as I did during the preview, I'll try not to talk too much throughout the startup process. I'm also going to leave the sounds turned right up, so just a warning, we're going to head outside shortly. For any headphone users, it's probably going to be pretty loud. Anyway, just waiting for the GTS indication at the moment. That should turn green momentarily. And we now have our GTS indication, so we can hit the engine start. And you can see we now have rotation on the engine. We're just waiting to come through at least 15% on the RPM before we introduce the fuel. So as you can see, we do have a good start. We're looking for a minimum of 52% on the RPM. We've got around 55 at the moment. The rotation and GTS indications are out. The oil, FPR and trans captions are out on the CWP. For the hydraulics, system 1 is checked. We'll check for normal flight control response. And that looks good, so we can now hit the hydraulic 2 system reset. And you can see the pressure coming up there on system 2, just waiting for the hydraulic 2 light to go out on the CWP. That's now extinguished, we just have the anti-skid remaining, which we're expecting. The after start checks, the trims are set to neutral. Carry out an air brake test, so the test switch can go on. We'll extend the air brake. As you can see, we do have air brake extension, so the test complete. We'll retract the air brake once again. And the test switch can go off. pitot heat can come on. Flaps will go to the mid position for the takeoff. And the flaps are set. Flight controls. We'll unlock the rudder pedals. And just checking that the flight controls are full and free. So the flight controls are checked. Hydraulics are checked and the pressures within limits. Oxygen. Again, the quantity is checked and we do have good oxygen flow. Canopy is locked and the arrows are aligned, and the flight instruments are checked. HRS is set to slave. IFF again not required, but the transponder can now go to TARA, and the ILS and the TACAN are off. And we are now ready for the taxi. So we just carried out our before takeoff checks, holding the aircraft on the brakes. We'll come up to full power. We'll aim for 100% RPM, we're looking for no more than 104%. And a max TGT of 665 degrees. So power is set, TGT looks good, no lights there on the CWP, we'll come off the brakes. Just using the brakes initially to keep us straight on the runway centre line. And coming up on 90 knots, we'll come back on the stick just to get the nose wheel off the ground initially. And just waiting for the aircraft to lift off. There's positive climb, the gear can come up. We'll pitch the nose down slightly, we'll get the aircraft accelerating, just coming up on 200 knots, the flaps can come up. And we're going to initially track south down the valley, just off the nose. We'll keep the thrust on until we go through 300 knots. Just making sure we don't bust through our 104% there. And there's 300, we'll come back to around 90% on the RPM. And we can start trimming out the aircraft, just feeling a little bit nose heavy at the moment. So just following the contours of the valley out towards the southwest. As you can see, we've got a few small townships just down below us. So we'll just continue to follow the valley, we can follow the river as well, out towards the town of Lintal. Then we'll be picking up the road to head out towards the west. Overall, the Hawk is a really nice aircraft to fly. I'm sure many of you saw my preview video already, but I really enjoy the way the aircraft handles for the most part. The slow speed handling does leave a little bit to be desired, but we'll discuss that more later on. But overall the aircraft just feels really solid on the controls. It's got a really nice feeling of weight to it, which is obviously lacking in a lot of aircraft in the sim. Anyway, the sun obscuring our view somewhat at the moment, but we're going to peel off to the right here through the gap in the mountains. We'll follow the road just out to the west of Lintal. Speed just coming through about 360 knots at the moment. Obviously we're going to lose some of that as we climb up the hill. And just coming up through 4,500 feet. You can see the road down below us. We're going to be following that out to the west until we get towards the town of Altdorf. And I have to say, the Swiss scenery just really spectacular in the sim. It's actually some of the more convincing scenery that I've seen in the sim to date. And I think the sim looking quite a bit nice as well after the most recent update. Anyway, just continuing to follow the road for now. We're about halfway through this particular leg. For me, the Hawk feels really nice and roll. It is a little bit heavier in pitch, but overall the flight model very convincing. It's very much as I would expect the Hawk to handle. That's just a summation on my part. I've never flown a light jet, a fast jet in reality. Anyway, we'll continue to follow the contours of the valley. We've still got the road down below us, as you can see. And coming back down towards the ground. The Hawk is just such good fun to fly as well. If you can find a valley area like this, it's great fun to throw around. And again, just following the contours of the valley, slowly coming back round towards the northwest. You can see we pulled up to about 5G so far. And the speed just through 400 knots at the moment. So Altdorf should be just off the nose, just before we reach the next set of hills. Just past Altdorf, we'll turn back up towards the north. We'll be flying overhead a lake briefly. And as I say, we'll track the lake. Only very shortly, we'll be turning back out towards the east. So we'll pull some G, we'll come in and cut through the hills. You can hear we do now have some nice breathing effects there as well. Up to about 6G there as we come around the corner. And now heading back out towards the east. Still doing 400 knots here at the moment. The Hawk not breaking too much of a sweat there as we pulled the G. But I'm sure the Hawk speaks for itself really in the video. As you can see, it's just such a fun experience in the sim, and a really strong one as well, as we'll discuss at the end. But for me, the Just Flight Hawk is one of the best products in the sim to date. It does so many things really, really well. Anyway, peeling off to the right, heading back out towards the east as I mentioned. And then we'll be cutting across the hills here to head back out to the north. So we'll just keep out to the left of this ridgeline. And we'll crest the tops of these hills, we'll drop back down into the valley. We're already well over 3/4 of the way through the run. Burned our way through about 250 kilograms of fuel there at the moment. Bleeding off some speed here as we make the climb. We're down through 340 knots at the moment. And we'll go inverted, we'll bring the aircraft back down towards the ground. You can see the valley just off the nose. And again, going to have to pull some pretty hard G here to get around the corner. Poor old pilot struggling away there. And there'll be another sharp turn out to the right, again coming over a lake, and that'll bring us pretty much towards the end of the run. So here's the lake just off the nose. And the airbase is just out to the northeast of the lake. Anyway, that's it for our low-level run. Once again, the Hawk is just such a great, fun little aircraft to fly. We'll take it up to altitude there, we'll carry out some manoeuvres. As I said, the low speed handling is one of the weaker areas of the product currently, I would say. So we'll run through that just to demonstrate that to you. So we'll come back up to full power. We'll gain a little bit of altitude here, probably need at least 10,000 feet with the hills. We'll try and stay over the lower terrain as we carry out the manoeuvres. Plenty of oxygen on board to be high altitude. We've still got more than 3/4 of our capacity. And just coming up through 10,000 feet, we'll go into a stall first. That's really the weakest part of the Hawk's flight model at the moment, I would surmise. That's obviously going to allow us to gain more altitude in the meantime, so we'll leave the power on. We'll pitch to 45 degrees as we currently are. And we'll just let the speed bleed off. We're already back through 120 knots. Almost fully back on the stick. I'd say the sound effects are really nice. You can hear there is a little bit of rumbling there. No visual buffeting. The nose does drop, I think, a little bit more aggressively than it did in the preview version, which is nice to see, but once again, no buffeting, not really any aggressive behaviour from the Hawk here as we're into the stall. The nose pitches down, the speed builds up. I've still got full back stick here at the moment. You can see we get a little bit more buffeting as we really enter into a bit of a secondary stall here, and the right wing wanting to drop to some degree, but overall, again, nothing significant. I'll put in some aileron just to see if we can drop the wing. And I'll go full rudder as well. So we can induce the spin to some degree there with the use of rudder. And we've actually got the aircraft into a spin now. We'll recover from that. As you can see, once you actually get the aircraft into spin, it's pretty aggressive. Just managing to recover in time. Yeah, so overall I have to say, I think the flight model has been improved since the preview version, or at least I never tried to induce a spin quite so aggressively, to be fair, in the previous video, but to actually get the aircraft to induce a spin itself is pretty hard. I had to actually kick in full rudder there, but once it spins it's pretty tough to recover from, so it's actually quite a nice challenge in that respect. Anyway, next thing we'll try is just a bit of an aileron roll, see what we get in terms of control response with high aileron deflection. We'll just build up a little bit of speed again before we do that, and we'll just turn ourselves back towards the airfield. So as I say, once you actually get the aircraft into a spin, I think the spin characteristics are very good. I just have a suspicion that the Hawk would more readily spin in reality at such low speed and with such high angles of attack, or at least enter into more of an aggressive stall, as I said. As I mentioned during the preview, the Hawk is obviously a training aircraft, so I'm sure it's designed to be somewhat forgiving in those characteristics, but nonetheless most swept wing aircraft are pretty unforgiving in that respect, even though the Hawk doesn't have much of a sweep on the wing. Anyway, the airbase is just down below us. We're up through 250 knots again now, so that'll be good enough for our aileron roll. Just get the aircraft trimmed, and we'll go full deflection to the left. Overall, I think the roll rate of the aircraft feels nice. As you can see, the Hawk is pretty sprightly if you want to use full control deflection. And lastly, just to cap off our manoeuvres, we'll try a loop. Overall, I think the aircraft handles very nicely in pitch as well. As I mentioned during the previous video, I think it does need quite a bit of trimming out initially, but once you've got it trimmed, it actually behaves quite nicely. And again, it does have a real feeling of weight to the aircraft. Particularly just after takeoff, it's a little bit of a handful in pitch. Anyway, through 400 knots, we'll pull about 4G here in the loop. Again, you can hear our poor old pilot struggling there as we pull the G. And over the top, you can see the airbase just down below us there. So we'll cut the power, we'll join in for a final from our present position. We'll come on to the air brake. And we'll try and find a little bit of a gap in the clouds to come back down. So all up, we pulled about 7G there during the sortie. Speed just coming back through 300 knots at the moment. And just coming back through 10,000 feet. Down to about 600 kilos of fuel on board, plenty left for the landing. But yeah, once again, hopefully the Hawk speaks for itself during the video, and as I mentioned during my preview, really all I can say is it handles very much as I would expect a small jet to handle in most regards. There are some exceptions to that. Again, I think the low speed handling to some degree, and also during the takeoff roll, the aircraft is much less sensitive than many other aircraft in the sim, but it's still a little bit twitchy in yaw, but it's not so much the rudder authority that's an issue, it's more that the aircraft very much still exhibits that sim tendency for any rudder input to induce roll as well, so you end up getting a little bit squirrely still on the takeoff roll if you aren't careful on the controls. Anyway, we'll come off the air brake. We're back through 200 knots, so we can take the gear down. So just coming around onto final, the before landing checks, the air brake is retracted, gear is down 3 greens, flaps are set, and the brakes are checked. After landing check is complete. Should be coming back onto the PAPI fairly shortly. And just coming up on the thrust slightly there to maintain the speed. Again, having to trim quite a bit here as we make the changes on the power and the pitch. If anything, we'll aim to put ourselves a little bit low on profile here as we don't have a ton of runway here at Molly. So it's coming over the threshold, chopping the power, holding the aircraft off. There's touchdown. We'll lower the nose wheel down onto the runway and we'll start coming onto the brakes. So we're just clear of the runway, we'll taxi back to our parking position, we'll carry out the aft landing checks, so the pitot heat can come off, as can the anti-skid. Cancel the caution there, that's just the anti-skid on the CWP, which of course we're expecting. Hydraulics are checked, the flaps can come up. Stick top is set to safe. Carry out a CWP test. And again, just the anti-skid on the CWP. Landing light is off. Anti-collision lights are set to red. And we'll leave the radios for now. Cabin air temperature is set. IFF is off and the transponder can come off. RLS and TACAN are off and that's the aft landing checks complete. So we'll come off to the next apron on our right, that's where we departed from. We'll get ourselves parked up again, we'll shut the aircraft down. And as usual, once we've got the Hawk shut down, we'll wrap up the review with my overall thoughts and opinions on the aircraft. As you can probably tell already though, I'm a pretty big fan of the Hawk. I think it's a really great addition to the sim. Anyway, just coming onto the brakes, we'll swing ourselves back round to face out to the west. Park brake can go on. And for the shutdown checks, the park brake is set, engine start switch is off, fuel pump switch is off, throttle, the HP fuel valve can go off. And we do have a good run down there on the engine, we'll cancel the warning. Cabin air conditioning can go off. LP fuel cock is off. Radios are off. And again, just cancelling the caution. External lights are set. Cockpit lighting is set as required. The parking brake will leave on. And the battery switches can come off. We'll get the oxygen off. And lastly, we'll open up the canopy. So that's the flight complete. Thank you very much to anybody that just wanted to tag along for that. Once again, a great fun little route, so I highly recommend going and giving it a go for yourselves. Anyway, as I said, we got the flight out of the way, so we'll now move on to cover some of the more specific areas of the Hawk as a product. One of the nice things about the add-on is you do get quite a bit of variety out of what is essentially one aircraft. We get both the T1 and the T1A as well as the Red Arrows variant of the Hawk. So we'll cover off in a little bit more depth exactly what that entails. Obviously in front of us at the moment we have the red arrows version of the Hawk. The T1 doesn't differ vastly there, it's really just the smoke pod that's the main difference on the aircraft. So we'll take a brief look at the T1A, which is the weapons capable version of the Hawk. So in front of us we now have the T1A, which as I said is the weapons capable version of the Hawk. I thought I'd take the opportunity to showcase another of the aircraft's liveries as well. On the subject of liveries, the Hawk comes with, I would say, around 12 plus liveries, all of which are really nicely done. Obviously the livery selection is fairly RAF centric, but no complaints from me as a Brit, and of course the T1 did spend a lot of its working life with the Royal Air Force. Anyway, between the three variants of the Hawk that were given with the product, the changes are not just cosmetic, we do also get some systems changes, but we'll touch on those in just a moment's time. In terms of the Hawk T1A's armaments, we can fit an AIM-9 Sidewinder missile, as you can see on the outer left pylon here. We can also fit the CBLS BDU-33 carrier, which is on the inner pylon. And just below the belly of the aircraft, replacing the Red Arrow smoke pod, we have the Aiden gun pod. Coming over to the right hand side of the aircraft, on the inner pylon we have the Matra rocket pod. And lastly, on the outer pylon we have the Cat M9 training missile. So overall, a nice selection of armaments there, and as I said, they're not just cosmetic, there are associated systems in the cockpit as well. That being said, whilst the systems in the cockpit do work correctly for the most part, the weapons themselves are not fully implemented. Obviously that's a little bit of a Microsoft Flight Simulator limitation. Whilst the weapons do affect the aircraft's weight and balance, unfortunately you're not going to be able to unleash an AIM-9 on any unwitting fellow simmers within multiplayer. Anyway, that just about covers the major external differences that we get between the three variants of the Hawk, and of course gives you the opportunity to see the available weapons as well. We'll now head back inside the aircraft and take a look at the various systems options that we get available to us. So as you can see, we're now in the front cockpit of the T1, sat just behind the pilot's ejection seat. Just before we go into depth on the systems, I thought it's worth mentioning that the aircraft can indeed be flown from both the front and the back seat. Both cockpits are fully modelled, as you can see. There's been no concessions made in the instructor's seat, it's every bit as good. Worth noting though, you can only fully fly the aircraft from one seat at a time, and you will have to select which seat you wish to fly from via the onboard tablet. Again, we'll discuss more about that in just a moment's time. My only minor gripe really with the product internally, it would be really nice to see a visual pilot model, particularly if you're flying from the front seat. It's obviously not a deal breaker, but I find it's one of those details that really adds to the immersion in an aircraft, particularly a military one. Anyway, back into the forward cockpit, and the first variant of the aircraft we're looking at here is the T1 variant with no gun sight, no GPS fitted. So the main things to note, there's no weapons panel above the UHF radio on the left side of the main panel. There's no ISIS control just below the AHRS unit, just in front of the joystick. And as you can see, we have a nice clear view out the front of the cockpit, pretty good visibility in the Hawk overall. The next variant of the aircraft that we're looking at is the Red Arrows variant of the Hawk. And you can see there are a few changes between this and the previous T1 variant that we looked at. Firstly, we now have the smoke pod fitted, so you can see there is a smoke pod control just above the UHF radio on the left side of the main instrument panel. We also have the smoke select controls up there on the coaming. We can choose between red, white or blue smoke. And we now of course have the GPS unit fitted just on the front of the coaming. One minor gripe that I would say here, I know a lot of people didn't like the original orientation of the GPS unit as it does block quite a bit of your forward visibility. But from what I've seen, the vertical unit was actually much more realistic, so at the very least it would be nice to have the option to change between the two orientations. Anyway, lastly looking at the T1A variant of the aircraft, you can see we now have the gun sight fitted. We also have the associated weapons control panel just above the UHF radio, again on the left. And we also have the ISIS gun sight panel just down below the AHRS unit, as you can see just in front of the joystick. So as I said earlier, the differences between the variants are not just cosmetic, there's quite a bit of systems depth there as well. You can very much mix and match between the options. For example, you can fit the gun sight to the Red Arrows variant, or you can fit the GPS to the T1. All of this can be done via the onboard tablet or EFB, which is what we'll be taking a look at next. So coming down to the tablet, which can easily be toggled on or off, we'll take a look at that in just a moment. As you can see, we have various options, much like we did on the Just Flight Arrow family. Firstly, we have our aircraft states. We have ready for takeoff, ready for start, or cold and dark. I always think that's a nice option. It allows people to get up in the air nice and quickly, and also you don't have to be too familiar with the aircraft to get it started up. Next we have an autopilot, which again I think is a really nice addition from Just Flight. The Hawk in reality does not come with an autopilot, but it's nice to have one discreetly hidden away here on the EFB, and it's actually quite a capable autopilot as well. As you can see, we have a master toggle, an out hold, a heading hold, a nav hold, and an approach hold. We can also select the altitude at which we want the aircraft to hold, so overall a very capable autopilot. You could probably quite happily fly the Hawk on VATSIM and do a pretty good job with it all. All in all, the Hawk is quite a manual hands-on aircraft, so it is nice to have that autopilot, just to relieve a little bit of the pilot workload on those longer sectors. That being said, with the Hawk's fuel capacity and fuel burn, you're not going to be going particularly far in any one direction. Lastly, on the bottom left we have the option to enable or disable a rear pilot model. That's only from the external viewpoint at the moment, as I mentioned. It would be really nice to see that also with the internal model of the aircraft. So next, coming up to our aircraft options, and as I said, pretty configurable in terms of how you can choose to set the Hawk up. At the top you can see we've currently got the Red Arrows variant selected, and we can choose between the Red Arrows, the T1 and the T1A. Below that we have the option to choose between having the GPS fitted, gun sight fitted. You can actually have both fitted as well, or of course you can choose to remove them altogether. And lastly, as I mentioned, you do actually have to choose which cockpit you want to be flying from. Currently, as you can see, we have the controls set to front. Otherwise, if you want to fly from the rear, then you have to choose rear. The control sticks tab is just an option to remove the visual model of the joystick. Not really a big issue in the Hawk though, they don't really block out much in terms of the instrumentation. Equipment, as you'll have seen from some of the various external shots earlier on, we have the option to add or remove chocks to the aircraft. The same goes for the various covers and flags. And lastly, the cockpit steps. We can also refill our oxygen system via the EFB. As you'll have seen, the oxygen does actually deplete throughout the sortie. And in terms of the doors tab, pretty straightforward there. We can choose to open or close the canopy, and also open or close the nose hatch. Lastly, we have our payload tab, which we've already looked at in terms of which weapons can be carried. But as you can see, you can choose each individual pylon, select whether you want a pylon, a launch rail, which particular weapon you'd like. Of course, you can remove them altogether, and it will give us our payload weight and the total aircraft weight. So overall, another nice user-friendly EFB from Just Flight. Again, it would be nice to see a little bit more functionality given in these EFBs, for example, the ability to look at charts. But nonetheless, it does what it needs to do, and as I said, we can easily hide it. We just need to click on the ground crew VHF PTT switch. Anyway, that just about wraps up the various options on the aircraft that we didn't get a chance to look at during the preview video of the Hawk. As usual, we'll now round off the review with my overall thoughts and opinions on the product. So I don't think I've kept my cards very close to my chest with this one. The Hawk for me, really one of my favourite add-ons in the sim at the moment. It's a really complete, very nicely balanced product, really doesn't have too many weaknesses, and importantly as well, it's really great fun to fly. As usual, I'll try and be objective and fair though, it does have a few weaknesses and we'll touch on those. The most obvious and perhaps the most important negative aspect of the product, again I think, is the low speed handling of the aircraft at the moment. That's purely conjecture on my part, again never flown the Hawk, but I strongly suspect that the aircraft would exhibit some more aggressive behaviours there at the stall. I think that's somewhat confirmed by the fact that once we actually induced the spin using the rudder there, the aircraft was actually pretty tricky to recover. As I mentioned earlier, swept wing aircraft are generally not very forgiving when it comes to low speed handling. But if anyone knows better than I do, please feel free to leave me a comment down in the comment section below. I'd be very interested to hear how representative the Hawk's flight model actually is in that department. And in terms of the flight model, my only other gripe really, as I mentioned, it's quite heavy in pitch during takeoff. I do wonder as to whether or not that's related to the trim setting. I did notice that in the T45 you set 3 units trim up, whereas the Just Flight manual calls for 0 on the trim. That may or may not be accurate, but I find myself needing quite a lot of aft stick to get the aircraft off the ground. And again, whilst the rudder behaviour overall is better than average in the Hawk, you do still get quite squirrely takeoffs as you get roll on the aircraft with rudder input. Otherwise though, I really enjoy the flight model of the aircraft, and again we'll touch more on that during the positives. The rest of my gripes are very minor in nature, and some of them really are just personal opinion. It'd be lovely to see multi-crew on the aircraft at some point, of course, although really I expect that's more of a sim limitation than an omission from Just Flight. We already talked about the GPS orientation. Maybe I've missed it, but it seems as though you can't choose between having a vertical or horizontal GPS. As I said, the preview version of the aircraft did have the vertical GPS. Personally, I'd much rather see that on the add-on, as that's certainly what I see on the real-world Hawks. But again, I realise that's probably a personal preference. Some people will prefer to have the realism, and some people will prefer to have the extended visibility. The pilot model we've already discussed a couple of times now. I think the pilot model overall is actually quite nice. Again, it would just be great to be able to see the pilot internally. Certainly in terms of the rear pilot model, as obviously most people are going to be flying from the front cockpit, but equally it'd be great to be able to fly from the back and see the guy up the front. Again, for me, those sorts of touches just really add to the immersion in a product. My last point, and again it's pretty minor but it is becoming a little bit of a personal bugbear, the default viewing positions in the Hawk somewhat face down from the horizontal. I realise that this is beneficial probably to the vast majority of simmers, particularly those who don't have track IR or much in the way of controls to set up various viewpoints. But as a track IR user, it is a little bit frustrating as you find that your viewpoint is somewhat offset. It wouldn't bother me if it was only one or two of the views that had this issue, but all of the views available by default in the aircraft do have a slight looking down tendency. Again, it's not a huge deal, but I find it preferable to just have the default view looking straight ahead. In terms of any middle ground, we'll briefly touch on the FPS before we move on to the positives. Overall, I was very pleasantly surprised. The aircraft cost me about 10 FPS versus the default Cessna 152. I think for such a beautiful and fairly complex aircraft, that's actually pretty impressive. And certainly, unless you're running the aircraft on an older machine and already really struggling for FPS, you shouldn't miss the difference too much. Anyway, moving on to my positives regarding the Hawk, and overall I think it's pretty easy for me to summarise what I think about the product. As of right now, it is currently one of my favourite products available in the sim, and in many ways it is currently my favourite product available. The Hawk is a very strong offering from Just Flight, really in every department. As we've looked at, the systems modelling, very in depth, very well done. The same goes for the visual modelling and texturing. The sounds are absolutely excellent, some of the best that we've seen in the sim to date, really one of the only jet aircraft in the sim that legitimately sounds like it has a jet fitted. A minor gripe with the sounds, which I think we touched on during the preview. Obviously the sounds are three-dimensional and the aircraft is just lacking a little bit of roar from that jet engine when viewed out from the front. But overall the engine sounds are excellent, and the internal sounds again really nice. I particularly like the attention to detail in terms of the cockpit switches and controls. We get some air noise as well, which makes a huge difference to the immersion during flight. Strangely, we don't seem to have seen that on too many Microsoft Flight Simulator aircraft to date, at least not done very well. The flight model, we've touched on the negatives, and again I don't have a frame of reference as to exactly how accurate the Hawk is, but I can certainly say it feels how I would imagine a light jet to feel. And again, overall it's a really great fun aircraft to fly, which of course is important as well. For me, it would be quite difficult to pick apart any single strength that the Hawk has, as once again it's a very nice, well-rounded, comprehensive product. I think I'll just finish up by using the same words that I did during the preview. It's really great to see that Just Flight continued to push the envelope in terms of what they've achieved in the sim to date. They've always been a decent developer, but they're really cementing themselves as one of the best developers that we currently have in Microsoft Flight Simulator. And with their Hawk, they're really raising the bar in terms of what we can and should expect from the sim. Anyway, the Hawk is retailing at £32.99, available from Just Flight directly. If you purchase the Hawk for either FSX or P3D, previously through Just Flight themselves, you'll also be entitled to a 25% discount. As always, I'll leave it for you to decide whether or not you think that's good value for money, and of course I realise that these sorts of aircraft are not everyone's cup of tea within Microsoft Flight Simulator. Anyway guys, as always I do hope that you enjoyed the video and found it to be of use. Once again, if you did like what you saw, then please consider giving the video a like. If you want to see more content from the channel, then please consider subscribing as well. A very big thank you once again to my channel members and patrons for all of your support. And thank you very much to each and every one of you for watching the video. As always, I hope you're having a great day wherever you are, and I will see you all again soon.